In a silent office, a woman signs the divorce laughing, certain that she is leaving behind a bankrupt man with no future. On the other side of the table, he accepts every word of contempt with a disturbing calm, as if he already knew something that no one else there knew. While she plans a new life alongside another, there is a truth hidden just a few inches away, kept on a cell phone she didn't even bother to look at. And when this truth finally comes to light, it won't just be the money that changes everything, but the fate of everyone involved. Before discovering what really happened in this story of betrayal, pride, and a plot twist, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more surprising reports. The pen glided over the paper with an elegance that seemed rehearsed. Renata Drummond signed the last field of the document, and as she placed the instrument on the white marble table of the Carvalho and Associados office in the heart of Itaim Bibi, she smiled in a way that was not of relief, it was of triumph. There was something theatrical in that smile, something she had practiced mentally for weeks, like someone rehearsing the most important scene of her own life. And for her, it was exactly that. On the other side of the table, Marcos Drummond remained motionless, 42 years old, shoulders slightly slumped, unshaven, and a dress shirt without a tie. Details that, in Renata's eyes, confirmed everything she thought about him. A man who had given up. A man the world had forgotten before he even realized it. Renata's lawyer, Dr. Fabio Lorena, organized the documents with clinical efficiency, stamped each page, and spoke without looking up from the table. Everything is in order. The total separation of assets is approved, including the clause for future assets. Mr. Drummond, do you confirm that you are aware of the terms? Marcos raised his eyes slowly. There was no anger in them. There was something Renata interpreted as resignation, but which, if she were more attentive, she would recognize as absolute control. I am aware, he said in a low and calm voice. Renata opened her Italian leather bag and took out a 50 real note. She slid it across the table toward her ex-husband with 2 fingers, like someone giving alms to a stranger. For the taxi, she said, and the laughter that followed was short, sharp, intended to hurt. Dr. Lorena pretended not to see. Marcos looked at the note for a long second. Then he pushed it back, without haste. I won't need it. Renata took the note, put it in her bag with a shrug, and stood up. She straightened the beige blazer over her tight dress, ran her fingers through her straight, dark hair, and walked toward the door without looking back. Her heels echoed on the porcelain floor, like a metronome marking the end of something. She was almost at the exit when Marcos's voice cut through the silence. Renata. She stopped. Not out of affection. That had ended long ago. She stopped out of curiosity, for the possibility of witnessing some kind of plea that could feed the narrative she would tell her friends later. She turned slowly. Marcos was standing, cell phone in hand. With a calm gesture, he slid the device across the marble table toward her. The screen was lit. I thought you should see this, he said. Renata approached with slow steps, like someone who doesn't want to show interest but cannot resist. She leaned over the table. Her eyes scanned the screen. The number was too large to be processed immediately. She read, reread, blinked twice. The bank balance displayed 8 digits. The silence that took over the room at that moment was not like an ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes a collapse, the exact moment when the ground disappears from under one's feet and the body has not yet received the signal to fall. What is this? She whispered. The result of the sale of the Solaris patent, Marcos replied, and there was something in that tone she had never heard from him before. Peace, a peace that needed no witnesses. Renata stood still. The Italian bag slipped slightly from her shoulder. But the story that reached that office that morning had not started there. It had started much earlier, on garage nights illuminated by a computer monitor, in arguments that grew like the tide, and in a love that unraveled so slowly that neither of them knew for sure exactly when it had gone away. It had started perhaps the first time Renata looked at her husband at a party and pretended not to know him. It was a Saturday in October, almost 2 years prior. Cecilia Montero's apartment in Alto de Pinheiros was full of people wearing expensive clothes and talking about investments like people discussing the weather. Renata moved through the environment with the naturalness of someone who belongs, smiling at the right people, holding her glass at the right angle. Marcos had arrived later, coming straight from the co-working space where he spent his weekends refining the code for Solaris, the intelligent contract management software he had been developing for 3 years without any company having shown concrete interest. His shirt was slightly wrinkled and his hair was messy. He spotted Renata on the other side of the room and waved. She looked away. He crossed the room anyway, embarrassment in his spine but a smile on his face, and approached the group where she was talking with Gustavo Almeida, a real estate entrepreneur, gray hair at the temples, a watch that cost more than Marcos's car. "Hi, everyone," Marcos said naturally. There was a microscopic silence, the kind that only exists for those who provoke it. "Oh, Marcos," Renata said, with an artificial lightness that took him a second to identify. "You know Gustavo, right?" "Gustavo, this is a friend of mine." "A friend," Marcos smiled. He greeted Gustavo. He stood there for a few minutes and then went to get something to drink alone, while Renata laughed at a joke Gustavo had told. That night, in the car on the way home, neither of them spoke about the episode. But Marcos kept that moment in a specific place in his memory, the place where things are kept when one doesn't yet know what to do with them. And it was in that place that other memories began to accumulate, one by one, silent as sediment at the bottom of a river. In the months that followed that party, Marcos tried to believe he had misinterpreted the situation. He was good at that, at finding reasonable explanations for behaviors that from a distance had no explanation at all. Perhaps Renata just didn't want to mix environments. He was a software engineer, not a psychologist, and he preferred equations to suppositions. Then Solaris began to consume everything. The project had been born from a simple observation. Large companies lost contracts due to document management failures, due to expired deadlines that no one had monitored, due to clauses that no one had reread. Marcos spent 2 years developing an intelligence system that cross-referenced contract data, sent early alerts, and generated predictive reports. The idea was good. The problem was that without capital for marketing and without a contact network in the corporate world, no one opened the door to listen. The debts arrived with the implacable patience of one who knows that time is on their side. First the cards, then a loan to cover the server, then another, smaller one, to pay the accountant. The Pinheiros garage that served as an office became an ambiguous symbol. For Marcos, it was the place where something was being built. For Renata, it was proof that he had been left behind. "You need to stop this," she said one afternoon, in the kitchen of the apartment they shared in Brooklyn. Her back was turned, organizing groceries with that irritated precision he had learned to recognize as a prelude to a fight. "It's been 3 years. No company has bought it, no investor has appeared. Until when?" "Until it works," Marcos replied, with the simplicity of someone who truly believes what they are saying. She turned and looked at him as if that answer were in itself proof that he was lost. That is not an answer. That is stubbornness disguised as faith. He didn't talk back, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned that some verbal battles had no winner, only wear and tear. And the wear and tear in that marriage had already reached a level that both pretended not to measure. What Marcos still didn't know on that afternoon in the kitchen was that Renata had already begun to plot an exit. Not impulsively, she was too meticulous for that. It was a calculated exit, built brick by brick through meetings she described in messages as work lunches and happy hours with the team. Gustavo Almeida had transformed from an acquaintance into something she preferred not to name precisely. The messages they exchanged at night, when Marcos was in the garage with his laptop, had a heat that went beyond any professional definition, and while all this was happening in silence, Marcos Drummond received, in an email on an ordinary Tuesday, a message that would completely change the fate of that story. The email had arrived on a Tuesday in November at 11:42 p.m., while Marcos was finishing correcting an indexing module in Solaris. The sender was a company he didn't know. Vortex Capital Tecnologia, headquartered in Sao Paulo, with offices in Lisbon and Chicago. The subject simply said, "Proposal for patent acquisition, Solaris software." Marcos stared at the screen for a few seconds without blinking. Then he reread it. Then he closed the laptop, left the garage, went into the kitchen, drank a glass of water, went back to the garage and reopened the laptop. The email was still there. Written in precise legal language, the text presented Vortex Capital as an investment fund focused on technology applied to the legal and corporate sector. They had identified Solaris through a technical publication Marcos had made 2 years earlier in a specialized forum, a publication he had practically forgotten. The initial proposal was for the total acquisition of the patent for a value that, upon being read, made Marcos exhale slowly, like someone who has just received an impact that the body has not yet processed. There were many zeros. He said nothing to Renata that night, not because he wanted to hide it, at least not yet. There was something in the magnitude of the moment that demanded silence, as if any premature word could break the spell or worse, make real a hope that did not yet have enough body to survive the touch of reality. In the following days, Marcos responded to the email with caution. He asked for more information, requested a meeting with representatives from Vortex, and consulted a lawyer specialized in intellectual property, Dr. Renato Queiroz, who worked in a discreet office on Haddock Lobo Street, far from the circuits Renata frequented. The meeting with Vortex took place on a Thursday in a neutral cafe in Itaim Bibi. 2 young executives with iPads in hand and that calm confidence of those who have enough money not to need to demonstrate it. They explained that Solaris solved a problem that several companies in their portfolio faced, and that, after a technical analysis conducted by hired engineers, they concluded that the technology was not only functional, but difficult to replicate in the short term without infringing on the patent. Marcos listened attentively, asked technical questions, drank his coffee. Inside him there was a silent storm that he controlled with the same discipline he had learned to control code bugs, isolating, identifying, resolving one at a time. That same day, upon arriving home in the late afternoon, he found Renata dressed to go out. Navy blue dress, hair tied back, gold earrings. "I have dinner with clients," she said, without him having asked. "All right," Marcos replied. She took her bag and left. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the elevator go down, and then went to the kitchen to make a sandwich. There was something in that scene, the naturalness with which she left, the absence of any invitation, the Italian bag that had cost more than a month's rent for the garage, that began to join other images in Marcos's memory with a disturbing geometry. Cecilia Montero's party, where he had been introduced as a friend. The messages Renata received late at night and answered with the phone tilted slightly away from him. The weekend she traveled for a corporate retreat in Campos de Jordão and came back tanned in a way that didn't match November. Marcos was not the type of man who searched through phones, not out of naivety but out of a matter of personal integrity. He had decided years ago that he would never be the type of partner who spies. But there was a difference between spying and simply paying attention, and he had paid enough attention to know that something was wrong. The confirmation came in a way he hadn't planned. It was a Saturday morning, and Renata's phone had been left on the kitchen counter while she took a shower. It wasn't locked. Marcos didn't go to it. It was the phone that vibrated twice in a row, displaying on the notification screen the name G, followed by a message preview that he read accidentally, or perhaps without wanting to avoid it. "After you resolve the inventory situation, we can finally—" The message cut off there, but it was enough. Marcos stood still in front of the counter. The coffee maker bubbled in the background. The sun entered through the kitchen window at a low angle early in the morning and gilded everything with an irony he couldn't ignore. He didn't touch the phone. He took his cup, went to the balcony, and looked at the city for a long time. São Paulo was waking up down there, indifferent, with that permanent energy of one who never stops to consider the small tragedies that happen in each of its millions of apartments. When Renata came out of the bathroom, she found Marcos sitting at the table with his laptop open as always. Nothing seemed different, and that was exactly what he decided to maintain. the appearance that nothing had changed, because something had shifted in him that morning, not love, which had been worn out for a long time, but strategy. Marcos Drummond had understood, with the cold clarity of an engineer facing a corrupted system, that the solution was not in confrontation, it was in the code. And the code he knew how to write better than anyone Renata had underestimated in her life. In the following days, Marcos continued his routine with almost surgical precision. He woke up early, had coffee, went to the garage. He returned late, ate whatever was there or ordered delivery, slept beside a woman who had already decided to leave but had not yet bought the ticket. It was a piece of domestic theatre that both performed with disturbing competence. What changed, invisibly, was what he did in the garage. Dr. Renato Queiroz, the lawyer from Haddock Lobo Street, was a man of few words and much experience with agreements that needed silence. He spent 3 hours listening to Marcos in the first meeting and at the end said, "There is a way to structure this that protects you on all fronts. It will require patience." Marcos replied that patience was the only thing he had in abundance. The Vortex due diligence process lasted weeks. External engineers analyzed the Solaris code line by line. Marcos sent encrypted files, participated in video calls when Renata was out, and kept everything on a secondary laptop hidden behind boxes of obsolete equipment in the back of the garage. It was an exercise in a double life that deeply discomfited him, not out of guilt, but out of a kind of early mourning. He was staging a bankruptcy that didn't exist, inhabiting a version of himself that wasn't real, all to protect himself from someone who had once promised to be his port. While the negotiation advanced behind the scenes, the situation at home followed its predictable course. Renata had increased the frequency of her nightly outings. The explanations were always plausible. Networking events, international clients, colleagues' birthdays. Marcos listened and observed, not with resentment, but with that analytical attention he applied to behavior patterns. It was on one of those nights that he made the most difficult decision of the process. He had received, on the secret laptop, a draft of the final acquisition contract. The values were even higher than those initially discussed. Vortex had discovered during due diligence that Solaris had applications in 3 additional sectors, which significantly raised the strategic value of the technology. Dr. Renato had reviewed every clause and considered the agreement fair and well protected. All that was missing was the signature. And it was there, at that moment of absolute clarity, that Marcos Drummond committed the only act of deliberate manipulation in that whole story. A lie planted with surgical precision, intended not to destroy Renata, but to reveal what she had already decided to do. Dining together on one of the rare nights at home, Marcos let slip, with a worried air and tired voice, that he had received a proposal to sell the only asset he still owned in his name, a plot of land in the countryside inherited from his father, to invest in a high-risk opportunity that a contact had presented. "It might be a mistake," he said, cutting his chicken slowly. "But I don't think I have a choice. The debts are coming." Renata listened to him in silence. He didn't look her in the eyes. But he could feel, in the quality of that tense silence, that something had moved in her, and that the next move would be hers. The call came the next morning, while Marcos was in the garage reviewing the Vortex contract for the 3rd time. It was Dr. Renato Queiroz, with the voice of someone who sleeps well because they organized everything before lying down. "The process is ready for the final signature. We can schedule it for next week if you confirm." "I confirm," Marcos said. He hung up the phone, closed the laptop, and stared at the ceiling of the garage for a long time. There was an old leak in the corner, a yellowish stain he had promised himself to fix when he had money. He thought, with a gentle irony, that soon he could buy the whole building if he wanted to. That same afternoon, Renata arrived home earlier than usual. She had that expression of someone who has just made a decision and needs space to execute it. She threw her keys on the kitchen counter with a noise that was not accidental and went straight to the point. "Marcos, we need to talk." He was sitting on the sofa with a book he wasn't reading. He raised his eyes with the cadence of someone who expected exactly that. "You can speak." She sat in the armchair in front of him, not beside him, a detail he noted, and crossed her hands over her knee with that composure she used in difficult meetings at work. "I want a divorce." The word landed in the room like a heavy object. Marcos stared at her for a few seconds. There was no surprise on his face, and that disturbed Renata more than she expected. She had rehearsed that scene assuming some kind of reaction: hurt, anger, plea. Anything that confirmed he still needed her. What she found was a serenity she didn't know how to interpret. "All right," he said. Renata blinked. "All right?" "All right," he repeated with the same calm voice. "If it's what you want, I respect it." She was silent for a moment, reorganizing the internal script she had prepared for that conversation. She had rehearsed answers for resistance, for crying, for promises of change. She had not rehearsed an answer for that. "Aren't you going to ask anything?" she said, and there was in her tone a mix of relief and strangely disappointment. "What do you want me to ask, Renata?" She stood up, went to the window, and stood with her back to him, looking at the Brooklyn buildings lighting up in the early evening. There was something in that posture, the slightly raised shoulders, the tense jaw, that Marcos had learned to recognize as the moment she was calculating how much she could get in a negotiation. "I need it to be total separation of assets," she said, still with her back turned, "including anything that comes after. I don't want to be tied to your debts." "Of course," Marcos replied. She turned then and looked at him with an expression that tried to be of pity, but came closer to contempt. "Marcos, you are going to need to start from scratch. Are you aware of that?" "I am." "The land you mentioned yesterday, you shouldn't sell it. It's the only concrete thing you have left." He almost smiled. Almost. He held it back with the discipline of someone playing chess and knowing the next move decides the game. "Are you advising me now?" She looked away. "I'm being reasonable." "Thank you for the concern," he said slowly. "But I've already made my decisions." Renata took her bag, went to the bedroom, and Marcos heard drawers being opened and closed down the hallway. She was inventorying, mentally or physically, what she would take and what she would leave. It was the kind of thing a person does when the exit is already better planned than the arrival ever was. That night, lying in the dark with Renata sleeping on the other side of the bed with that rigidity of someone pretending to sleep, Marcos thought about the first time he had seen her. At a university event, she had arrived late and crossed the entire auditorium without apologizing, as if the world should wait. He had found that fascinating. It took years to understand that what he had interpreted as confidence was, in fact, a deep inability to consider that other people also existed with the same intensity as she did. In the following days, the pace of the separation advanced with a speed that confirmed how much she had planned everything in advance. Her lawyer, Dr. Fabio Lorena, was a specialist in family law and had been contacted, Marcos would later discover, weeks before the conversation on the sofa. The total separation of assets clause, including future assets, had been drafted with a specificity that only made sense if the person who requested it believed they were protecting themselves from something concrete. She was, in fact. She had just calculated incorrectly which side the danger was on. Between the conversation on the sofa and the date set for the divorce, living together in the apartment took on that strange quality of a space shared by two strangers who hadn't yet split the expenses. Renata slept in the master bedroom. Marcos had voluntarily migrated to the guest room without either of them commenting on the transition. The mornings were silent, the nights invisible. She went out, he stayed, and the apartment became too big for one person and too small for both at the same time. On one of those mornings, while having coffee before going to the garage, Marcos received a message from his older sister, Juliana, who lived in Campinas and with whom he had maintained sparse contact during the years of marriage. She had written only, "I'm here if you need me." He hadn't said anything to the family about what was happening, but Juliana always knew how to read between the lines where others read only silence. He replied with a heart emoji and put the phone away. There was something liberating in that small gesture. As if by recognizing that someone truly knew of his existence, he could breathe a little deeper. He didn't need advice or an audience for what was about to happen. He just needed to be sure that when it all ended, there would be real people on the other side. Marcos signed the contract with Vortex Capital on a discreet Thursday in a room at Dr. Renato's office on Haddock Lobo Street, with 2 witnesses and without any ceremony. There was something deliberately simple about that moment. No toast, no photo, no celebrations. Dr. Renato had extended his hand for a firm handshake and said, "Congratulations, Marcos. You built something that is worth it." It was the first genuine professional compliment he had heard in years, and it came from a man he had known for less than 2 months. The agreed value was transferred in stages, with the first installment, already enough to make any financial anxiety a distant memory, credited 2 business days later. Marcos stared at the balance in the bank app for a long moment, not with the euphoria of someone who won the lottery, but with the specific satisfaction of someone who planted a seed in soil that no one believed was fertile and saw the tree grow alone, in the dark, against everything. The divorce date had been set for the following Monday. Marcos arrived at the Carvalho and Associados office in a dress shirt, no tie, with a stubble. Not out of carelessness, but because he had consciously decided to appear exactly as Renata expected him to appear, as the man she had chosen to leave behind. She entered 10 minutes later in her beige blazer, high heels, and that smile of someone who arrived to reap what they sowed. And during the entire bureaucratic ceremony of the divorce, while Dr. Lorena stamped and organized and confirmed terms, Marcos sat with the phone in his pocket waiting for the right moment. With the patience of someone who built something over 3 years, and learned in that process that time was always his only true ally. The Carvalho and Associados office was on the 12th floor of a mirrored building on Brigadeiro Faria Lima Avenue. The receptionist spoke in a low voice, and the chairs in the waiting room were white and uncomfortable in a way that seemed purposeful, as if the environment wanted to remind everyone that legal matters should not be comfortable. Renata had arrived first. She was sitting with her back straight and her phone in hand. She wore the beige blazer, high heels, and gold earrings. She had prepared for that moment with the care of someone who knows that appearances are also documents. When Marcos entered, she raised her eyes briefly and went back to her phone. He greeted the receptionist and sat 2 chairs away, without ceremony. The silence between them had that specific quality of those who have already said everything that mattered, and what remained could no longer find a way to become words. Renata broke first, without looking at him. "Did you bring the documents Lorena asked for?" "I did." "Good. The faster we resolve this, the better." "I agree." She finally looked at him, and there was in that look a mix of impatience and the need to confirm that he was still what she had decided he was, a project that wasn't worth the investment. "Are you going to stay in the garage?" she asked, with a tone that tried to sound practical but came close to condescending. "I haven't decided yet." "Marcos?" She lowered her phone. "You need to be realistic. With the debts you have, maybe it's worth thinking about going back to Campinas, staying with your mother for a while." There was something genuine in that advice that disturbed him more than any direct cruelty would have. She truly saw him that way, as a man who needed to go back to his mother's house. "Thank you for the concern," he said, with the same phrase he had used on the sofa, in the exact same intonation. She made a gesture with her hand that meant something between "as you wish" and "there it goes." The hallway door opened and Dr. Fabio Lorena appeared with that energy of a crisis manager. "You may enter." The meeting room had a white marble table and beige leather chairs. One wall was entirely of glass, with a view of Faria Lima below, where traffic moved with the characteristic slowness of Monday mornings. Marcos's lawyer, recommended by Dr. Renato, was sitting on one side. Dr. Lorena sat on the other. Marcos and Renata occupied the central seats, facing each other, with all the history of the last few years between them. The process took 40 minutes. Each clause was read aloud, confirmed by the parties initialed. The total separation of assets was confirmed with emphasis. Dr. Lorena read that clause twice at Renata's request, as she wanted to be sure that the wording specifically included any assets or holdings acquired after the signature date, by either party, individually. Marcos heard that sentence and kept his expression neutral. Renata signed with an elegance that seemed rehearsed. The pen glided over each field with a firmness that was also a message. I am leaving by choice, not by defeat. It was the signature of a woman who believed she was moving toward something better, to a successful man, to a life that finally matched the image she had built of herself. When she finished, she clicked the pen closed and left it on the table. It was then that she took the 50-real note out of her bag. She slid it across the white marble toward Marcos with 2 fingers, like someone giving a tip to a waiter who provided a mediocre service. "For the taxi," she said. Dr. Lorena did not react. Marcos's lawyer fixed his eyes on the documents. Marcos looked at the note. For a second that felt longer than it was. The office was completely silent. Then he pushed it back with the tip of a finger, without haste. "I won't need it." She put the note in her bag with a shrug, stood up, straightened her blazer, and walked toward the door. Her heels echoed on the porcelain floor with that cadence of someone exiting the stage, convinced they had won. She was almost at the door when his voice reached her. "Renata." She stopped. She turned with that slowness of someone who prepared not to show anything. Marcos was standing, phone in hand. He slid the device across the marble table toward her. The screen was lit. "I thought you should see this." She approached slowly. She leaned over the table. Her eyes scanned the screen and then stopped. She read. She reread. The bank app was simple, with a white background and clear font, and the displayed balance left no room for alternative interpretation. There were 8 digits before the decimal point. The silence that settled in was of another kind now. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers waiting for bureaucracy to be concluded. It was the silence that precedes the perception that an irreversible step was taken in the wrong direction. "What is this?" she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "The result of the sale of the Solaris patent," Marcos replied. "Closed last week." Renata stood still. The Italian bag slipped slightly from her shoulder. She looked at Dr. Lorena with the eyes of someone who is still looking for an exit in a hallway that has already closed completely. "Can the contract be contested?" Dr. Lorena opened his hands over the table with a gesture that was both an answer and an apology. "The clause for future separation of assets was inserted at your express request and confirmed twice in this room. The process is formally closed." Renata did not answer. Because there was a truth there that she could not reorganize into an argument. She had built with her own hands the clause that excluded her from everything, moved by the desire to protect herself from his supposed debts. But the debts were a performance. What was real had been kept in a garage in Pinheiros, growing in silence, while she went out for dinners with another man and laughed at her husband's failure at apartment parties. Marcos stood on the other side of the table waiting without haste, and Renata looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, because anger requires an injustice she could no longer locate, but with the expression of someone who finally sees a landscape that was always there and chose not to see. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like what it was. Too late. She left the office without looking back. Her heels no longer echoed with the same firmness as before. There was something different in their rhythm now, a slightly off-kilter beat, like that of someone still walking in the dark after their eyes have already opened. Dr. Lorena organized the documents with professional efficiency and withdrew without comment. Marcos's lawyer greeted him with a brief handshake and also left, leaving him alone in the white marble room with the phone on the table and the view of Faria Lima on the other side of the glass. Marcos stood still for a moment, then he took the phone, put it in his pocket, and went to the window. Down there, São Paulo kept moving with the characteristic indifference of a city that doesn't stop to witness the personal turnarounds of its millions of inhabitants. Buses, cars, pedestrians, the constant rhythm of a metropolis that never knew anyone's name but housed every story. He had entered that building as the man Renata had decided he was. He was leaving as the man he had always been, only now the world would also know. Gustavo Almeida learned the news through a channel he hadn't expected. Dr. Lorena himself, who was a friend of a partner in an office Gustavo had worked with for years. São Paulo was a city of 12 million people and 15,000 poorly kept secrets, and certain information traveled the corridors of money with a speed any social network would envy. The information was simple. Marcos Drummond had sold the Solaris patent for a value that made any plan of ascension based on him unnecessary, and any plan of ascension based on Renata useless. Gustavo received this news on a Thursday afternoon at a lunch at Spot on Augusta, where he had arranged to meet a colleague from the real estate sector. He sat in silence for a few seconds, with his fork frozen in the air. Then he kept eating. Then he asked for the check. That night, Renata tried to call 3 times. He didn't answer. The next morning he replied with a message that had the surgical precision of someone who chose each word carefully. "I need some time. A lot of things happening on my end right now." It was one of the oldest phrases in the repertoire of those who are ending something without wanting to be held responsible for the ending. Renata stared at the message on her phone, sitting on the bed of the apartment that had been hers and Marcus's and was now only hers. She had kept the property in the separation, which had seemed like a victory until the day before. Now, the apartment was just an expensive place she would need to maintain alone, with the salary of a marketing consultant that paid well but didn't pay for everything she had grown used to expecting from life. She reread Gustavo's message. Then she reread it again. There was something she recognized in those words, on a frequency that took a moment to identify. It was the same tone she had used with other people at other times, when a situation had ceased to be convenient. It was the tone of someone exiting through the side door without making noise. For the first time in many months, Renata Drummond was truly alone. Not alone in the sense of being in a room without company. Alone in the broader and more difficult sense. Without the plan she had built, without the security she had calculated, without the narrative that she was walking towards something better. The apartment was silent. The city outside produced its usual noises, horns, construction, the distant bark of a dog, but they arrived filtered through the window glass like sounds from another world. She lay on the bed looking at the ceiling for a time she couldn't measure. There was no anger at that moment. The anger would come later in manageable doses over weeks. There was something harder to name, a kind of shock at herself, as if she was seeing for the first time with clarity the sequence of decisions that had brought her there. Not as a victim of anyone. That reading would be more comfortable but less honest. As the protagonist of choices that had seemed rational in each isolated moment and that, seen in sequence, formed a portrait she didn't recognize as her own. She got up, went to the kitchen, made coffee. She stood at the counter where, weeks ago, Gustavo's phone had landed with that notification message that seemed at the time a confirmation that her plan was working. Now the counter was just a counter. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Marcos had arrived at the Pinheiros garage for the last time. Not to work. He had ended the lease the previous week, and Vortex Capital had already sent a team to survey the equipment that would be transferred to their office. He had gone to pick up the last personal belongings, some technical books, a mug his sister Juliana had given him as a birthday present, and the wall of post-its. He stood before the yellowed papers for a long time. There were ideas there he had never implemented, questions he had never answered, fragments of reasoning from nights when the code didn't work, and he needed to put his thoughts somewhere outside his head. It was a private archaeology, the stratigraphy of 3 years of invisible work. He took some post-its off the wall carefully. Others he left. There was something right about leaving part of it there, as if the garage needed to keep some memory that something had been built within its walls of concrete and ceiling leaks. He took the mug, the books, the chosen post-its, and went to the door. He took one last look. The afternoon light entered through the side window at a low angle and gilded the cement floor in a way that made the place more beautiful than it was, or perhaps more beautiful than he had perceived while he was in it. He closed the door, handed the key to the building's janitor, thanked him for the time, and went out into the street in Pinheiros with that specific lightness of someone who finally set down a weight they had carried so long they forgot what it was like not to carry it. The phone vibrated. It was Juliana. "When are you coming to Campinas? My mother-in-law is having a barbecue on Sunday." He smiled. He replied that he was going. And for the first time in a long time, there was in front of him not a problem to solve, but an open afternoon, without a deadline, without debt, without a performance. Just São Paulo all around, with its vastness and its noise and its generous indifference, the city that had been the stage for all of that without judging anyone, and that would continue to be the stage for everything that came next. That night, Marcos stayed at a simple hotel downtown, not out of necessity but by choice. The Brooklyn apartment was still in the process of transfer, and he had decided he didn't want to spend even one more night in a place that had ceased to be a home long before the signing of the divorce. The hotel had a clean bed, a quiet bathroom, and a window with a view of a stretch of Consolação, where an old tree had pushed the pavement aside over decades, curving the concrete with the slow patience of one who knows that time was always on their side. Marcos looked at the tree for a long time before sleeping. There was something in it that felt familiar to him, that discreet insistence, that growth no one had seen happen, but that was there, undeniable, in the result. He slept well, better than he had slept in months. The next morning he woke up without an alarm, had coffee at the hotel counter with two old men who discussed football with the intimacy of those who do that every morning for years, and then opened his laptop for the first time without haste, without code to correct, without a deadline to meet. He had emails from Vortex with onboarding details, a message from Dr. Renato confirming the second installment, and a notification from a technical forum where 3 years earlier he had published the article the Vortex team had found. There were 6 new comments on the article, all from people who wanted to know more about Solaris. He closed the laptop, finished his coffee, and went out to the street. São Paulo was waking up all around, with that energy of a city that never sleeps, but every morning pretends to start over. 3 weeks after the divorce, Renata Drummond was sitting in the meeting room of the agency, where she worked as a senior marketing consultant, listening to a client talk about the repositioning of a cosmetics brand, when her phone vibrated discreetly on the table. It was a news alert. The headline read, "Vortex Capital acquires patent for Brazilian software for record value. Technology promises to transform contract management in the legal sector." The report was from the business section of one of the country's largest technology portals. There was a photo of the Vortex office, impressive numbers, and, in the 5th paragraph, the name of the technology's creator, Marcos Drummond, an independent software engineer from São Paulo. Renata placed the phone face down and went back to listening to the client. But the meeting had ceased to truly exist for her at that moment. What existed was the image of that paragraph with Marcos's name occupying a space in her head she couldn't close. After the client left and her colleagues returned to their desks, she stayed alone in the meeting room for a few minutes. She opened the article again on her phone, reading carefully this time. There were technical details she didn't understand, but the numbers were universal, and the portrait that emerged was of a technology that had been developed for years in precarious conditions, ignored by the market for too long, and that had finally reached the right hands. There was also a quote from the CEO of Vortex that she read twice. "We identified Solaris in a technical forum where the creator had published a detailed article 3 years ago. What surprised us wasn't just the quality of the solution. It was the fact that someone had built something of this level practically alone, without external capital and without recognition." She closed the article. Outside, the city continued. Inside her, something had settled with the specific weight of truths that cannot be undone. That same week, the apartment bills arrived. Condo fees, property tax installments, electricity, internet, the health plan she had contracted alone after leaving the joint regime. Added up, the numbers were not impossible, but they were enough to make visible, with a clarity that previous planning had obscured, that she had based her financial security on the expectation of a relationship that had not materialized in the way she had calculated. Gustavo had disappeared with the specific elegance of men who never explicitly admit what they are doing. Messages became rare, plans were postponed with plausible justifications, until silence had simply taken the place of everything. She had tried, on a night of more weakness than pride, to call one last time. He had answered, talked for 4 minutes about a business trip and a lot of things happening, and hung up with a vague promise that both knew would not be kept. It was, she recognized, exactly what she deserved, not in a punitive sense, but in the sense that she had reaped a relationship built on convenience and found convenience in return. The difference was that when the convenience had ended for Gustavo, he had left. When it had ended for her in the marriage with Marcos, she had also left. The symmetry was perfect and uncomfortable. On a Thursday afternoon, Renata left the office earlier than usual without giving explanations and went for a walk in Ibirapuera. It wasn't something she usually did. There were always meetings, clients, projects, the continuous architecture of a schedule that left no space for walking without a destination. But something that day had demanded open space and visible sky, and she had obeyed without rationalizing. She walked through the park for almost an hour. She observed families by the lake, groups of friends, solitary runners, couples arguing in low voices, and others laughing at jokes only they understood. It was the less-known São Paulo, not the city of meetings and cars and projects, but the city of people who simply exist in a shared space without any specific purpose other than being there. She sat on a bench near the museum. She took her phone out of her bag, opened the photo gallery and looked at old images. There were some from the wedding, not the ceremony, which she rarely revisited, but photos of daily life. One of Marcos sleeping on the sofa with a laptop open on his chest. Another of the two in a market, her back turned choosing vegetables, and him making a funny face at the camera she had raised on a whim. There was a smile in that photo, his, genuine, without a pose. The kind of smile a person makes when they don't know they are being photographed. She stared at that image for a while. Then she put the phone back in her bag, closed her eyes for a moment, and listened to the wind in the park and the distant noise of the city all around. There was much to think about. There were decisions to be made, bills to organize, a life that needed to be reconfigured without the foundations she had presumed would be there. But that was not the moment for decisions. It was the moment to sit on a bench in Ibirapuera and let the weight of it all land where it needed to land before she could, with honesty, start getting up again. And she stayed, until the sun began to fade over the buildings in the background, and the park took on that golden late afternoon light that transformed for a few minutes even the most ordinary places into something resembling beauty. That night, back at the apartment, she called her mother for the first time in weeks. Not to tell everything, she wasn't ready for that, but to hear a familiar voice in a space that had become too silent. Her mother, Dona Beatriz, answered on the second ring with that readiness of someone who is always available for the people they love, regardless of how much time has passed since the last call. "Renata, how wonderful, daughter. I was thinking of you today." "I know, Mom, I know. They stayed on the line for almost an hour." Renata sat on the floor of the living room with her back against the sofa, her legs stretched out, the window open to the São Paulo night. Dona Beatriz talked about the garden, about the new neighbor, about a series she was watching. Renata listened, asked questions, laughed at some moments, a smaller laugh than usual, but genuine. When she hung up, the apartment seemed slightly different. Not resolved. Nothing had been resolved. But habitable in a way it hadn't been for some time. She went to bed. She stared at the ceiling in the dark, as she had done so many other nights in those months, but this time without the tension of someone rehearsing the next step. There was only the ceiling, the silence, and the night outside doing what the night always does, passing with or without permission toward the next day. And Renata Drummond, for the first time since everything had started to fall apart, let the next day be just the next day, without a plan, without calculation, without the weight of a narrative she didn't yet know how to rewrite. On the other side of the city, Marcos had gone to the barbecue in Campinas on Sunday, and returned transformed by something that was not the food nor the wine, but the specific quality of being seen by people who truly knew him. Juliana had hugged him with that intensity of an older sister who doesn't need words. Her husband Paulo, a quiet and observant history teacher, had touched on the subject only once. "Are you okay, truly?" And when Marcos replied that he was, he had accepted it without needing more. The table had been abundant, the day had been long, and when it was time to return to São Paulo, Juliana had stood at the front door with her arms crossed and a smile. "You are going to be happy, you know," she said. "You were always good at starting over. It just took you a while to believe it." Marcos had gone a few seconds without answering. Then he gave a hug that lasted longer than usual. In the car back, with the dark highway all around, He thought about that phrase, good at starting over. There was much that remained. 2 months after the divorce, Marcos Drummond's name had traveled through the technology and corporate law circles of São Paulo with that specific speed of stories people like to tell because they seem made up. The engineer who spent 3 years developing software in a Pinheiros garage without anyone taking him seriously. The $1 million sale to an international fund. The divorce signed days before with a separation of assets clause that excluded the ex-wife from any share in the results. The story had reached an entrepreneurship podcast, which had transformed it into an episode about persistence and timing. It had also reached a WhatsApp group of which Cecilia Monteiro, the hostess of the party where Renata had introduced Marcos as a friend, was a member. Cecilia had forwarded the article to 17 people with a 3-word message that dispensed with any additional comment. Renata had not read that message, but she had read others, and a point had come after the 3rd week, where she had simply stopped opening certain groups and certain conversations, building a bubble of silence around herself that was both protection and necessity. Work had become the center of balance, not out of sudden vocation. She had always liked what she did, but because the office was the only place where she was still clearly competent, where the rules were known, where effort produced traceable results. She had taken on a large brand repositioning project for a chain of dental clinics, plunging into the briefing with an intensity that her colleagues noticed and interpreted as ambition, but which was, in fact, the most honest way she had found to get through the days. It was on a late working afternoon, when the office was already almost empty and she was finishing the last review of a presentation, that the phone rang with a number she didn't have saved. She answered out of reflex. "Renata." The voice was male, slightly formal. "My name is Andre Bassi. I am a partner at the Bassi and Montero office, corporate law. I know it's an unexpected contact, but I received your recommendation from a mutual colleague, Fernanda Lopez, from the Plural Agency. We are in need of a marketing consultant for an institutional communication project, and your name came up more than once." She stayed silent for a second, then she said she was listening. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Andre Bassi had the voice of someone who thinks before speaking, which she noted and appreciated. The project was solid, repositioning the visual identity and external communication of a medium-sized office that was growing and needed to update its presence in the market. It was exactly the type of work she knew how to do well. They arranged a coffee for the following week to talk further. She hung up the phone and stared at the computer screen for a moment. There was something slightly absurd in it. The world continued. Projects continued. People called with opportunities. Conversations happened. Life followed its rhythm with that gentle indifference that doesn't ask permission. She had spent weeks feeling like someone who had gone off the rails, as if the accident that had happened in the white marble office on Faria Lima had frozen time around her while the rest of the world advanced. But the rest of the world had not advanced without her. She had just stopped paying attention to it. She saved the presentation, closed the laptop, and left lighter than she had arrived. That same week, Marcos had met for the first time with the Vortex Capital team in an office in Vila Olympia, modern and open, with plants in the middle of the room and tables without dividers. There were 6 people around a light wood table, all talking about the future of Solaris with the energy of those who are building something, not just managing what already exists. The technical director of Vortex, a woman named Patricia Yamada, had presented a development roadmap that expanded the technology to 3 new sectors within 18 months. She had gone through the slides with efficiency and precision, and Marcos had realized, listening, that those people had taken less than 2 months to see potentials he had glimpsed, but had not been able to articulate alone. There was something humbling and liberating in that at the same time. Humbling because 3 years was a long time for someone to have stayed invisible. Liberating because Solaris now had a team, a budget, a structure, things a Pinheiros garage could never offer. At the end of the meeting, Patricia had asked if he would be interested in remaining involved in development as a senior technical consultant. The proposal included remuneration, a share in the results, and schedule flexibility. Marcos had said he needed to think. She had said she understood and that there was no rush. In the elevator back to the ground floor, He had been alone for a few floors and thought of the post-it from the garage. What is a solution for that no one sees? The answer, he finally understood, was not philosophical. It was practical. A solution that no one sees needs to find those who will see it. And sometimes that takes time. Sometimes it takes 3 years and a garage with a ceiling leak. But it arrives. The following week, Marcos accepted the Vortex proposal, not because he needed the money. The sale of the patent had resolved that comfortably, but because there was something in the idea of continuing to build, of seeing Solaris grow beyond what he had managed to do alone, that seemed like the natural continuation of everything, rather than the closure. He had spent 3 years believing in a technology that no one else saw. Now that others saw it, stopping seemed like a waste of perspective. He settled into a rented apartment in Pinheiros, a few blocks from the old garage. The new place had large windows, a narrow balcony with a view of the backs of other buildings, and a cafe on the corner that opened at 7 in the morning. It was simple, it was comfortable, and it was completely his. On the first morning in the new apartment, Marcos woke up early, made coffee on the balcony while the city woke up all around, and opened his laptop without urgency. There were emails, a report from Vortex to review, messages from acquaintances who had read the articles and wanted to resume contact with that specific curiosity of those who are recalibrating where a person fits into their own narrative. He replied calmly to each one, without haste, without the anxiety of previous years. There was something different now, not in the city, not in the people, but in his relationship with his own time, as if he had finally found the rhythm that belonged to him, which meant there was no longer a need to run to prove something that was already proven. There was a message from Juliana saying she was happy. He replied that he was too, and it was true. Not the performative happiness of someone who reached some destination and wants everyone to know, but that quieter, more solid happiness of someone who knows that the path they are walking is their own. The kind of certainty that doesn't need an audience, that exists even when no one is looking. That was built not in a table turn in a marble office, but in 3 years of nights, in a garage where the only witness was the ceiling leak and the city outside that doesn't know anyone's name. He finished his coffee, then he opened the Vortex report and started working. The cafe on the corner of the Bassi and Montero office was one of those places that exist in São Paulo without needing to announce it. A dark wood counter, thick cups, window light, and the noise of the street entering through the always ajar door. Renata arrived 5 minutes before the time and stood at the counter waiting, which was unusual for her. She always arrived exactly on time, or slightly late, an unconscious strategy of those who prefer the other to wait. Andre Bassi arrived punctually, 40 years old, short hair with some grey at the temples, a dress shirt without a tie of someone who works in an office that decided to be serious without being formal. He had a firm handshake and a way of looking that was attentive without being invasive. "Renata, thank you for coming. Of course. I was curious about the project." They sat at a table in the back. Andre ordered coffee without sugar, she ordered the same. He opened a thin folder with a printed briefing, a detail she noted, few clients still printed, and went straight to the point. The office had grown 40% in the last 2 years, attracting medium-sized clients in the technology and intellectual property sectors. The external communication, however, had fallen behind. The site was old, the visual identity was generic, and the brand positioning did not reflect what the office had become. "We need to look like what we already are," said Andre, with that precision of someone who knows exactly what they want, but doesn't know how to ask for it. "We don't want grandiosity, we want credibility." Renata listened attentively, asked questions about the target audience, about the main differentials of the office, about the competitors they admired and those they wanted to differentiate themselves from. It was the kind of conversation she knew how to conduct well, and there was something comforting in realizing that this competence had not disappeared in the previous months. It had just been stored away, waiting to be used. At the end of 40 minutes of conversation, Andre closed the folder. "I think you understand exactly what we need. Would you be up for it?" "I would," she said, without hesitating. They closed the terms by email the following week. It was a 4-month project, with a well-defined scope and fair remuneration. It wasn't the largest project she had handled, nor the most glamorous, but there was in it a clarity of purpose that some of the previous, more flashy projects lacked. In the weeks that followed, Renata plunged into work with a concentration that was not escape, but presence. There was a difference, she was discovering, between working to prove something and working because the work itself matters. For years she had operated in the first mode, building an image, a position, a narrative of arrival. Now, for some reason she couldn't completely articulate, but felt as relief, she was simply doing the work. One afternoon, reviewing the new brand positioning for the Bassi and Montero office, she had written in an introductory sentence, "Advocacy built on what truly matters, what you have to say and how you say it." She had reread the sentence and spent some time looking at it, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was true. And there was something in the act of writing something true that satisfied her in a way she had forgotten how it felt. André had approved without modifications and said it was exactly that. In one of the alignment meetings, they met once a week at a cafe near the office, he had asked an unexpected question at the end of the conversation. "How did you arrive at brand identity marketing? It's not the most obvious path for someone who starts in advertising." She had thought for a genuine second before answering. "I think I've always been more interested in the question, 'Who are you?' than 'What do you sell?' The second is easier. The first is where things get interesting." André had stood looking at her for a moment, not with the evaluating look of a client, but with that of someone who heard something they recognize. "That makes sense," he said, and changed the subject. But she had carried that answer with her on the way back to the office. There was something in it that echoed beyond the professional context. Who you are, instead of what you sell. She had spent years building a version of herself that was, essentially, a sales pitch. The woman who belonged, who circulated, who was always on the rise. She had invested in this version with the seriousness of someone investing in an asset, and she had discovered, in the most uncomfortable way possible, that assets can devalue when the market changes. What remained when the sales pitch disappeared was the question she had avoided for a long time. Who was she, in fact, when she wasn't trying to be what she thought she needed to be? There was no ready answer, but there was, for the first time in months, a willingness to look. On the last Friday of August, Renata left the office on time, went to the street market, bought ingredients for a pasta her mother had taught her years ago, and that she rarely made, and cooked alone in the apartment with music in the background and the window open to the night. The pasta was good. She ate on the sofa without a screen, listening to the city outside. It was an ordinary night, and there was something extraordinary in just that. That same night, on the other side of the city, Marcos had finished the first version of a new personal project, not linked to Solaris, not commissioned by Vortex, but something that had arisen from a conversation with Patricia Yamada about gaps that the market had not yet resolved. It was a preliminary idea full of unanswered questions, but there was in it that specific energy of a beginning that he had learned to recognize, the feeling that something is worth being built even before knowing exactly what it will become. He saved the file, closed the laptop, and went to the balcony with the last glass of water of the day. The night in Pinheiros was clear, one of those meteorological accidents in which pollution recedes and São Paulo shows it has stars too. There was light in hundreds of windows around, each with its invisible story, its particular drama, its version of everything a life can contain. Marcos stood on the balcony for some time, not thinking about Renata, not thinking about the divorce, not reviewing the past with the look of someone still trying to understand what went wrong. He had made that journey in the previous weeks and had reached the only place he could reach, to the understanding that some stories end not because someone failed, but because they followed different directions from the start, and the difference between the directions only becomes visible after the path has already been traveled. He had been hurt. He had been angry at certain moments, with that quiet and controlled anger of one who feels but does not perform. There had also been, at very specific moments in the last few weeks, a sense of missing certain versions of Renata, the one who laughed at bad jokes at breakfast, the one who had strong opinions about architecture, the one who always slept with the window ajar even in winter. Those versions had truly existed. They just hadn't been enough to hold the rest. But all that was falling behind. Not erased, he wasn't the type of person who erases, but filed in the right place, where the things that have already been stay without taking up the space of those that are yet to come. He drank the last sip of water, went back inside. Slept. São Paulo continued outside, lit and noisy and completely indifferent, doing what big cities do best, sheltering, without judgment, all beginnings and all endings at the same time, in the same night, in the same urban immensity, where each lit window is a story no one from outside can read completely, and maybe that's exactly why they stay lit. 6 months after the divorce, São Paulo was in October, that October in São Paulo of sudden heat and late afternoon rains that arrive without warning and pass with the same haste. The jacarandas on Paulista Avenue had bloomed again with that violet violence that happens every year, and every year surprises those who pass by. Marcos Drummond was sitting at a table in a restaurant in Pinheiros, not the type of restaurant one frequents to be seen, but the type one frequents because the food is good and the noise is human. He was with Patricia Yamada and 2 other engineers from Vortex, and they were talking about the new Solaris module, with that mix of technical enthusiasm and practicality of those who have already passed the phase of dreaming and moved to the phase of building. There was something different about him that the people around noticed but rarely managed to name. It wasn't the money, though it was real, and had resolved issues that previously weighed like concrete blocks. It was something else. It was the manner of a person who stopped apologizing for their own existence, who had learned in the hardest and most definitive way possible that the value of something is not defined by those who cannot see it. The conversation in the restaurant was good. The food was better. When they left, Marcos walked back to the apartment 3 blocks away, through the streets of Pinheiros he already knew by heart, with that familiarity of someone who chose a place to be and didn't just stop where life pushed. The balcony awaited him with the open sky and the city all around. That same afternoon, on the other side of the city, at the Bassi and Montero office, Renata had presented the final version of the brand identity project. André Bassi had listened to the entire presentation without interrupting, which she had learned to recognize as a sign of genuine attention, not indifference, and at the end had said simply, "It's very good. It's what we needed." She had thanked him without exaggeration, packed up the materials, and left the office with that specific satisfaction of work completed with honesty. On the sidewalk she had stopped for a moment. The October sun hit the facade of the buildings with that late afternoon light that gilded the edges of everything. People passed by, buses passed by, the city passed by. And she had stood still for a few seconds in the middle of all that, without an immediate destination, without haste. Just present, in a way that had been difficult to achieve, but that now arrived without her needing to build it. There was no dramatic resolution for her story. There was no moment when everything makes sense suddenly, and life reorganizes itself into a coherent narrative. There was, instead, what life usually offers to those who stop demanding narratives. Days that arrive with their opportunities and their challenges, work that matters, people who call at the right time, her mother's pasta on a Friday, the window open to the night. There was also, if she were honest, and she was learning to be, a lesson she hadn't asked for but had received anyway. That the value of people is not determined by what they produce while they are by our side, but by what they carry within themselves, independent of us. And that underestimating someone is always, in the final instance, our own loss. She had underestimated Marcos. She had chosen to see only what confirmed what she wanted to believe, and she had built with that choice a version of reality that seemed solid until the moment the phone screen showed it was made of presumption. There was no paralyzing regret in this understanding. There was something more useful. Discernment. The willingness to look at people, at herself too, with more care and less certainty. And there was, too, an entire city around, impossible to be summarized, impossible to be exhausted, always larger than any story that happens within it. São Paulo doesn't know anyone's name, but it keeps all the stories, That of a man who built something invisible for 3 years in a garage with a ceiling leak, and left there with the certainty that time had been his only real ally. That of a woman who spent years running toward a version of herself that had no roots, and who, upon stopping to finally breathe, discovered that the ground under her feet was more solid than she had presumed. That of a love that didn't last, but that left, as every love leaves, something that no contractual clause can regulate. The knowledge of oneself that only happens when we are seen by someone, even if that someone, in the end, did not stay. And somewhere between those two stories, the city continued, with its noises and its lights, its garages and its marble offices, its October jacarandas and its cafes, open at 7 in the morning, sheltering without judgment everything a life can contain when it stops trying to be what it isn't and begins, finally, to be what it always was. End of the story. If this story touched you in some way, if you have ever felt invisible when you deserve to be seen, or if you have gone through the difficult moment of recognizing that you underestimated someone who mattered, then you know that these stories speak of something real. Here on the channel, that's exactly what we bring: narratives that go beyond drama and reach what is most human in each of us. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the right moment. Every week, there's a new story waiting for you. Leave your like because it helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. And tell us in the comments, what part of this story came closest to you? We read everything, and your answer is part of this conversation too. Every story you hear here was built with the care of someone who knows that well-told narratives have the power to return to us, something that daily life sometimes steals: the capacity to feel, to reflect, to recognize in the lives of others the fragments of our own. Marcos and Renata are characters, but the garage, the nights of invisible work, the clause that turns against the one who wrote it, all of that truly exists in stories that happen every day, in big and small cities, in offices and garages, in the moments when someone's value finally reveals itself to those who didn't want to see it before. Stay with us. The next stories are already being built, with the same dedication, for you.